Hello, welcome back scholars. Good evening everyone. I hope all of y'all had a wonderful day and welcome back to the class. So I am Nikitha and as most of y'all know, I teach history at Unacademy and specifically I'll be taking classes for standard 11th and 12th, but as of now I'm taking classes only for standard 12 and starting from September 1st the provision for class 11 will also be made, right? Well, just a little bit about me. I have very recently graduated from Ashoka University with a bachelor's degree in history and a minor in political science. Right. So before actually moving on to today's topic, I would like to brief y'all about some of the Unacademy Plus benefits y'all can avail by subscribing to Unacademy Plus. The first one is y'all can actually sit at the comfort of your own homes and listen to some of the top educators' live classes. And you will also have unlimited access to all the courses from different departments and subjects, right? Also, there are regular doubt solving sessions, regular answer writing sessions, along with practice tests and live test series. And another factor here is there will be an exhaustive coverage of syllabus wherein you don't have to worry about missing out on a particular topic because every educator at Unacademy Plus, they make sure that they are following a pattern and they make sure that they are covering the syllabus in a very exhaustive manner, right? And also there is mentorship given to you, guidance given to you, along with access to study materials in the form of PDF. The way in which you can actually avail these Unacademy Plus benefits is by subscribing, and there are a range of subscriptions in specific 5, which is 6-month subscription, 12-month subscription, 15, 18, and also 24-month subscriptions. Here, the fact established here is that the longer period of time you take a subscription for, as in the more number of months, you will be benefited because at the end of the day, you're gonna save yourself a couple of bucks if you subscribe for a longer period, right? And after that, not just Unacademy Plus, Unacademy also has iconic subscriptions. Here the features are even better and greater than Unacademy Plus. Firstly, there is personal mentorship given to you, which basically is mentors are given to you on a one-on-one basis, and you can approach him or her for any doubts regarding your subject, right? And there are also live doubt solving sessions and also weekly reports given to you to assess your last week's performance in tests and quizzes, right? There is also a direct parent connect. Your parents can directly connect with the personal mentor given to you along with the provision for study planners. Just like Unacademy Plus, Iconic also has the same range of subscriptions, which is 6, 12, 15, 18, and 24. The same policy can be applied here as well. The larger period of time you actually take a subscription for, the more beneficial it is going to be for you guys. Yes, so we are towards the end of chapter 3, and by today by the end of this class we will actually be winding up chapter 3, and after that we will have a couple of quizzes and then move on to chapter 4. But before that, what timeline are we talking about, especially when we are referring to chapter 3? We are talking about 600 BCE and 600 CE, the 12 centuries between this timeline, right? And basically the focus here is the social life. Yes, so this is the last but one subtext in your textbook, which is handling texts and historians and the Mahabharata, with obviously a special focus on the Mahabharata and how historians deal with various texts. So what we basically think of is, like a particular book is there, historians find that book and they start reading it. But that is not the case. Historians do not do that immediately. When they find a book or when they come across a particular book, let's say Manusmriti, right? Let's just take an example of Manusmriti. When historians come across this book, there are so many things that he does before actually reading what is there in the book, right? So these pointers are some of the things which the historians consider while actually before actually analyzing the texts. The first one is language, right? In which language the text is written. If it is a translated version, what was the language in which the original version was written, right? You might find texts in different languages. Either it can be Prakrit, either it can be Pali, Tamil, or Sanskrit. And you have to note a point here that if a particular text is in Prakrit, Pali, or Tamil, it meant that the audience was the common people, because only people knew only Prakrit, Pali, and Tamil, but they did not know Sanskrit. So if you find a text in Sanskrit, that basically meant that common people did not fall under the audience category, right? So this is considered a elite language, ELITE, right? And this is considered, these three are considered as common people languages. So the first point is language. Secondly, it is the kinds of text, right? If you look at the text, what is the content of it? Are there mantras in it, or are there normal stories, or are there rules laid down for the society to be followed? Like, what exactly is the content of the book, right? What is the kind of the text? If it's a mantra book, like basically all these Rig Vedas or Upanishads and all these kinds basically do have mantras in them. So that is called a mantra text. So that is the kind of text. The next is perspectives and ideas of the author. Here, before you know, like you will obviously know who the author is, unless it is an anonymous text. Like we've come across one anonymous text while doing this chapter, guys. If you all remember, we've talked about Periplus of Erythraean Sea, right? It was written by a Greek sailor, but we do not have the actual name of the Greek sailor. That is why we call it a anonymous text. So mostly we know who the authors are, because authors obviously put their names down on the books or texts that they write. So here you also need to analyze what is the social standing of the author, like where is he coming from, what is his point of view, what are his perspectives and ideas. So historians look at all these things before actually analyzing the text itself. The next is intended audience, like for whom is the book written, right? Like I've told here that if a book is written in Prakrit, Pali and Tamil, it is for the common audience. But if it is written in Sanskrit, then the book is for the elite audience, right? So the next one is the date of composition, like when was this text composed, right? For example, if you take Manusmriti, we know that it was composed somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. So roughly we will be able to figure out the date or the timeline in which the particular text was composed. The last thing here is place, like what is the place where this book has been composed, right? So these are just few of the pointers to give you an idea as to what are the things that historians will consider before actually analyzing the content of the text, right? Yes, only after these assessments the historian will look into the content. And obviously this will be a very difficult task to do if you are looking at a text like Mahabharata, because Mahabharata as a text is very complex, it is multi-layered, and we will learn why it is complex in the coming slides, right? So it will be a difficult task if you are reading books like Mahabharata. Yes, so moving on, one pointer we have is language and content, right? So we will dig a little more deeper into language and content here. especially in regards to Mahabharata. So the next couple of slides are are while talking about Mahabharata, right? So all of us know that the language used in Mahabharata is Sanskrit, but you also have to remember that the Sanskrit used in Mahabharata is totally different from the Sanskrit used in Vedas or the Prashastis. Because in Mahabharata, the Sanskrit is very simple. Like, it is not a classical Sanskrit where all these Sanskrit jargon words are there and all that stuff. It is a very simple Sanskrit. Even if we know like the basic Sanskrit, and if you try to read Mahabharata, you will be able to understand the gist of it. Like, it is not a very complex Sanskrit. But on the other side, if you look at Vedas or Prashastis, right? Prashastis are basically inscriptions written in praise of a person. If you look at them and the language used in them, they are very, very complex. It's almost like classical Sanskrit, where even a person who has Sanskrit knowledge would not be able to understand the whole text. Only a Sanskrit scholar can understand, right? So that is the language part of Mahabharata. The next, when we come to contents of Mahabharata, so many people have read the text, and finally some of the historians have classified the content of the Mahabharata under two broad categories. What are they? The first one is stories. Like, so many verses mentioned in Mahabharata are telling us stories, right? Like stories of different characters, stories happening at different times, at different places. So that is a narrative form, which follows a narrative form. The second classification is prescriptions about social norms, which is also known as didactic. Like, the form is didactic. What this basically means is some of the verses of Mahabharata tell us what are the rules to be followed while you're living in a society, or what are the norms established by the Brahmanas for common people to follow, and stuff like that related to the rules and regulations about the society, right? So one is the stories and the other is prescriptions about social norms. These are the two broad categories of the contents of Mahabharata that the historians have classified. The next point to be remembered here is, when we are talking about this division, be it stories or prescriptions about social norms, we need to understand that this division is not rigid and it is not like a watertight thingy. But sometimes, while you're referring to the stories section of Mahabharata, you might come across social norms as well. And while you're looking at prescriptions about social norms, sometimes there might be stories also, like intermix of both the things. So it is not a very hard and fast rule that division existed very rigidly, right? So, but usually one agreement among the historians is that they agree that Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic, moving story. So they are telling the audience that the actual intention of the Mahabharata, or when Mahabharata was first written, it only contained stories, but as time passed by, after a couple of decades or after a couple of centuries, the didactic portions were added, like the social norms were added later on. This is agreed by everyone and this is a fact. We are not assuming this statement, but instead it is a fact, right? Yes. And Mahabharata is described as an itihasa within the early Sanskrit traditions. The point is pretty self-explanatory, right? So what is the literal meaning of itihasa, right? If you know what subjects are called in Hindi, like for example, what maths is called in Hindi, or what science is called in Hindi, what geography is called in Hindi, if you know what those are, you will also realize that history is called as itihasa in Hindi. So itihasa's meaning is nothing but thus it was, like this has to be in double quotes, thus it was, which basically translates to history. Like thus it was as in yes it happened. Like was is telling us the past tense. Yes, it happened in the past, which roughly translates to history, right? So one question we need to ask ourselves when we are talking about Mahabharata is, we know, all of us know what Mahabharata war is, right? But is that war real? Like, did it take place for real? Or is it just a story that people created, like following an oral tradition or something? So, that is one important question we always need to ask ourselves. And till today, even in the 21st century, so many scholars have been debating about it. Some portion of the scholars say yes, it was a true incident. Some of them says no, it is just a fictional story, like in reality it did not happen. Like there are different varied opinions. Exactly those 2 points are mentioned here. The first is basically, some historians think that the memory of an actual conflict amongst kingfolk was preserved in the narrative. Like this must have happened at some point of time, and it came down as a oral tradition, and at some point of time people actually wrote it down, and it was a real incident which happened between the kinfolk, basically the brothers who are Kauravas and Pandavas. Like actual conflict happened. But on the other side, other part of the historians argue that there is no corroborative evidence of the battle. If a battle happens, there has to be some evidence, right? If you go and search for evidence in the battlefield, you must find something. As you dig deeper, you will find something. But there is no corroborative evidence we find when it comes to Mahabharata battle. So, basing on this point, some scholars argue that no, this war did not happen for real. It is a story, or like a fictional thing which was created by people back then. So yeah, so that is about the language of and content of Mahabharata. And now we will talk about the authors and dates of Mahabharata, like who actually authored Mahabharata and when was it authored. Before actually going into the author's part, one misconception which we basically have, or like the which we studied in our earlier classes, is Mahabharata was authored by a sage or a saint called Vyasa. Everybody's all of us studied this in our lower classes, that Vyasa was the one who authored Mahabharata, right? But in reality, he did contribute to the writing of Mahabharata to a certain limit, but he is not responsible for all of the text, right? He only wrote portions of it. There are other authors also. So that is why in the brackets I had to put S. It's a plural form, not just one author, but many authors contributed to Mahabharata, right? So who wrote it? We're just having a little history of the Mahabharata itself. Here, the original stories by charioteer bards known as Sutas, who accompanied Kshatriya warriors to the battlefield, which was strictly oral. I will explain what this is. So, when the Mahabharata war was happening, right? Obviously there were chariots, like chariots were also involved in the war, and there is always a person who is in charge of the chariot, who is called as charioteer, right? He was not just a charioteer, but he was also a bard, like a poet, right? In yesterday's class we've talked about who bards are poets. So this person who was riding the chariot is a charioteer plus poet. So together their occupation was known as Sutas. So these people, when they actually accompanied the Pandavas or Kauravas to the war, to the Mahabharata war, they were in the battlefield. They are looking at whatever is happening. They know how many people are being killed, who is dominating the war, like all the details of the war, these people know. But again, these stories were never written down. They were strictly oral. Whatever these chariots and poets saw, they came back by the end of the day, and probably they must have told it to somebody else, like their family members or neighbors or friends, right? From like that, the information passed on from mouth to mouth, one mouth to another mouth, not just at one point of time, but as decades and centuries passed by, this story kept coming down orally from generations to generations. So that is the first part of how the like the content or the information of the Mahabharata came to be. The second point we need to understand here is this, which is from 5th century BCE, the timeline this chapter is focused on. Brahmanas committed to writing, right? So it was for the first time during 5th century BCE that Brahmanas actually had a thought that they have to put down all these tales or all these oral stories we have been hearing for so many generations now, and then they decide to write it down. So like there has to be a reason why they are writing it down, right? So here again, this is an assumption, this is not a definite answer. It says this was the time when chiefdoms of Kurus and Panchala were gradually becoming kingdoms. We have seen in the 6th century BCE and even before that, we had Kuru and Panchala regions. But Kuru and Panchala till then, till 5th century BCE, were chiefdoms. But at that point of time, exactly, these two chiefdoms were in the transformation phase, like they were in the process of becoming a kingdom. So the status is being changed from a chiefdom to a kingdom, right? So this was the time when the new kings who were ruling over Kuru and Panchala thought that since their regions, like Kuru and Panchala were the places where all this Mahabharata happened, right? Like Mahabharatas, we've seen how Pandavas and Kauravas belonged to Kuru region, like they were Kuru princesses, right? So the new kings who were ruling over Kuru and Panchala, they thought that since the content of Mahabharata happened in Kuru and Panchala, why not write it down? It is good. Obviously, they wanted to preserve and record all the details, all the oral tales in a more systematic manner. That is why the kings have decided to ask the Brahmins to write it down, right? So this happened. This was the first step towards authoring the Mahabharata. The next is a couple of centuries later, right? So we are talking the phase about 200 BCE to 200 CE, towards the turn of the millennium. Then what was happening is that Vishnu was growing in importance. Everybody knows Vishnu, right? So basically Hindus have three gods: Brahma, Shiva and Vishnu. So Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu are considered the three major deities of Hinduism. So this was exactly the time when Vishnu was growing in importance. And just a brief intro to who Vishnu is and what avatars did he take up, right? So Vishnu actually had Dashavatara, as in Vishnu in different life forms took up 10 different births, like he had 10 different births. So there are so many, right? For example, he took the form of a Narasimha, he took the form of a Matsya, he took the form of Lord Rama, he also took the form of Lord Krishna, right? So we obviously know what Mahabharata is, right? In Mahabharata, Krishna played a huge role. Like Krishna was very much important in advising Arjuna when it comes to Mahabharata war. So we know Krishna played a huge role in Mahabharata. Krishna was nothing but Vishnu, right? Krishna is a form of Vishnu. So this was exactly the time was Vishnu was growing in importance. So all these factors clubbed together, it is very much tempting for people to write it down. So that was another period when some parts of Mahabharata were written down. The next is the last phase is between 200 and 400 CE, almost 2 centuries here. Here we actually see that the didactic sections were added. We've seen in the previous slide that originally Mahabharata was only a story, but as time passed by, then the social norms were added, right? Exactly, that this section proves that point. Initially, there were only stories, but from 200 BCE, these large didactic sections, which are basically social norms, they also have been added, and they have a lot of resemblance to the ideas of Manusmriti. If you look at Manusmriti text and Mahabharata's didactic sections, there are a lot of similarities, right? So this is exactly when Mahabharata initially had only 10,000 verses before this didactic version was incorporated. Once these social norms were added, it rapidly grew in size. From 10,000 verses, it almost comprised of 1 lakh verses now, right? So it grew in size very enormously. This happened between 200 BCE and 400 CE. Here, this addition is traditionally attributed to a sage named Vyasa. So, who added these extra verses? According to the traditions, according to the Hindu traditions, Vyasa, who is a sage or a saint, is supposed to have added all these extra verses. Now, we kind of can justify why people say that Vyasa was the person who authored Mahabharata, right? Because he almost wrote 90% of Mahabharata. That is why people refer to him as the author, right? So you all must be wondering, stretching from 500 BCE to 400 CE, almost for a stretch of 9 centuries, this text has been written orally, passed down, editions were made, like it just kept being edited and by people, right? So that is why in one of the classes we've talked about how Mahabharata was written over a span of 1,000 years. Like now we know, right, why it was written over a period of 1,000 years. Right. So the next subsection we have here is the search for convergence. We'll be talking about a specific archaeologist called B.B. Lal here. So just another factual information. Mahabharata, just like any major epics, it contains vivid descriptions of battles, forests, palaces, and settlements. It's not like Mahabharata is a text which only talks about kings, how he ruled, and all that stuff, but it has various elements in it. Namely, it talks about battles, it talks about the lives of forest people, it talks about what is happening in the palace, how the palace was run, and also common people settlements, right? So what happened is, in the year 1951 to 1952, just almost 7 decades earlier, there was an archaeologist, Indian archaeologist by name B.B. Lal. He was doing his excavations and researching about the Mahabharata timeline. He came across a village called Hastinapura, which is near to present day Meerut in Uttar Pradesh. So he excavated this village. Then what happened? If you look at the name Hastinapura, you might think that this Hastinapura is the exact same thing where we what is mentioned in Mahabharata, right? Like that Hastinapura and this excavated Hastinapura must be the same. But again, it might be true, it might not be true. It can just be a coincidence. But there are some factors, there are some evidences which tell us that the site excavated by B.B. Lal Hastinapura is exactly the same site as the one we study in Mahabharata, right? So what are those evidences? Firstly, when he was excavating the site, he found out that the location of the site is in the upper Ganga Doab, where the Kuru kingdom was situated back in those times. So if you look at the location, obviously we can prove the point that both these Hastinapuras are the same, right? And just a little bit on Lal's work. He found like 5 occupational layers, of which second and third are important to us. We will look at second and third in particular, but he found 5 occupation levels in total. Also, another point to remember here is all these 5 occupation levels, they were not belonging to the same time period. They were consecutive time periods, right? Yes, so here some of Lal's work. Lal's description of houses in the second phase. Out of the 5 phases, we are talking about the second phase here, which is 12th century to 7th century BCE. This is not the timeline this particular chapter is talking. In fact, this is a time period before what we actually are talking. We are starting from 6th century BCE, right? So this is before 6th century BCE. He says, again, not the information to by heart, but just to give you a deeper understanding of what and how did it actually work. Just read it normally. Within the limited area excavated, no defined plans, definite plans of houses were obtained, but walls of mud and mud bricks were duly encountered. So basically what he's trying to tell here is the way in which the houses were constructed back in those times in 12th to 7th century BCE. He says that usually the bricks used were mud bricks to construct the walls of the houses, and he found reed marks on the mud plasters, which basically tell him that the walls were made up of reed. Again, what is reed here? If you look at the picture here, there are single elements, there are individual elements. Let's just take this one, like I'm just calling it a stick for the better understanding. There are so many sticks here, right? So all these sticks come together, like they are brought together, they are attached and finally coated with mud. So that is called a reed. So Lal is saying that houses back in those times were constructed using mud plasters and reeds, right? So moving on to the third phase description. I told you all second and third phases are important to us, right? So the third phase basically lies between 6th century to 3rd century BCE. Here also houses were made up of mud bricks as well as burnt bricks. Here only mud bricks, but here mud bricks plus burnt bricks. Also excessive water was drained out, and terracotta, like wells were made up of terracotta material. They were also used as drainage pits. This is just a general information he gives us in the textbook, but not important when it comes to examination point of view. So y'all can leave this out. Yeah, so but these assumptions are important. What are the 2 assumptions about the descriptions made by Lal, right? So one assumption is that, was the description of the city in the epic added after the main narrative have been composed, after, when the urban centers flourished in the region? We know that urban centers flourished in the Indian subcontinent only in 6th century BCE. Before 6th century BCE, India had a very rural way of life and there were no cities. So can we come to a conclusion that this particular portions of the text which talk about the construction of houses in cities, were they added later on, like in the later parts of comprising Mahabharata? Were they added later on because initially there were no cities, and obviously if there are no cities, we can't talk about houses in the cities. So the point being, was this particular portion added later, like in the later times? That is one assumption or one question we can ask ourselves. The other is, or was it a flight of poetic fancy? Again, if you are totally denying the fact that Mahabharata happened for real, right? If Mahabharata did not exist in the first place, if it was just a myth or if it is just a fictional thing, then obviously whatever is mentioned in the book is imaginations, right? They are assumptions, they are fictional stories. If that is the case, then they can come up with any poetic fancy which do not need any evidence to corroborate them, right? So it can either be two of these, it can be either of these two assumptions. The next is source 16 of your textbook, which is Draupadi's marriage. Here guys, we are focusing, when we are talking about this source, we are mainly focusing on the concept of polyandry. Polyandry, as I've told you all a couple of classes before, is a practice where women has several husbands. Like a woman can marry multiple husbands in her lifetime. So here in Mahabharata, we have one of the challenging episode, and we will be talking about polyandry. The main question being how, before, there's a story to it, which is basically Draupadi's marriage, right? I haven't written it down on the slide, but I will just explain in 2 minutes. Listen carefully, guys. Here what happens with Draupadi's marriage, all these Pandavas belonged to the Kuru kingdom, but Draupadi was a princess belonging to the Panchala kingdom. And Draupadi's father was named Drupada, right? So Drupada announces that there is a archery contest happening in his kingdom, and the other kingdom, other princes from other kingdoms can come and participate in the archery competition. So all the Pandavas, they go to the Panchala kingdom to participate, and it's time for the competition. Competition was happening, and eventually Arjuna wins the competition, because we know that Arjuna was the best when it comes to archery, right? So Arjuna tried to win the competition, and he did win it. And towards the end of it, Drupada declares that the gift for the winner is that he is going to give Draupadi in marriage to the winner. So this gift was announced after the competition was over. So obviously he has to stick to whatever he told. So he married Draupadi and Arjuna, and then all the 5 Pandavas, after the marriage, they came back to their own kingdom, which is Kuru. And even before so Pandava's mother was called as Kunti Devi. So after coming back, Kunti Devi, without listening to what the Pandavas were saying, she makes one statement that whatever gift y'all got by winning the competition, all the 5 brothers are supposed to share it amongst themselves. Because honestly, Kunti doesn't know that the gift was a girl. Gift was Draupadi. Kunti thought, like some gold or some ornaments or some coins must have been gifted to the winner. So that is why she was saying distribute equally amongst the 5 brothers. But after some time, she got to know that the winner was none other than a woman called Draupadi, and she felt really bad after making that statement, because once the statement was made, she can't take it back. So now she has to marry all the 5 brothers, because equally she has to be distributed among all the 5 brothers. And when this conversation came up, it was obviously difficult to convince Drupada, because Drupada only thought that her daughter will be a wife to Arjuna, but now according to Kunti's statement, Draupadi should be a wife to all the 5 brothers, right? So there are n number of ways in which Vyasa Maharshi convinces Drupada that it is not a problem to get Draupadi married to all the 5 brothers. Like Drupada is basically, Vyasa is basically taking the side of Kunti Devi. So one part of the convincing is that Pandyas, Vyasa basically is telling Drupada that Pandyas were in reality incarnations of Indra, whose wife had been reborn as Draupadi, and thus they are destined for each other. Again, the statement is pretty self explanatory, which basically says Pandavas in their initial birth was none other than the figure of Indra. Indra was a god back in those times, and Draupadi also in her previous birth was Indra's wife. So now that they are reborn, they are destined to be together. So it is not a problem to marry her to all the 5 brothers. You can get her married. The next, that is one part of convincing Drupada. The next part of convincing Drupada is that he tells a story in the previous, again belonging to the previous birth, that a young woman, she actually prayed to Lord Shiva that she wants a husband, which means she wanted to get married, and she prayed to Lord Shiva that, like to help her get married. Here what happened, out of enthusiasm, she prayed for 5 times instead of once. Like she asked Shiva to get her married, like she prayed basically for 5 times. So because of that, Shiva is fulfilling that woman's wishes by giving 5 husbands, because she asked for 5 times. And that is why that woman is none other than Draupadi in this birth, and that is why she is getting 5 husbands, right? I hope this point is clear. And yeah, so obviously after listening to these 2 statements made by Vyasa, Drupada was kind of convinced that yes, her daughter can marry all the 5 princes of Pandavas. Yeah. So the next slide. Now we'll actually be talking about the concept of polyandry. There are a lot of assumptions that we can make, and historians have already made. To be very specific, we'll be talking about 5 assumptions here. The first one is this: the fact that authors describe a polyandrous union indicates that it may have been prevalent amongst ruling elites at some point of time. If something is mentioned in a particular text, and a huge text like Mahabharata itself, then we can rely on that, because at some point of time this practice must have been prevalent in the society, and that is why it is mentioned in the books. That is why the author made it a point to mention polyandry. That is one assumption. The second one is, we actually see a lot of different explanations, right? Like even here when we are talking about the ways in which Drupada was convinced, we are telling totally 2 different narratives. Once Vyasa is telling that they are incarnations of Indra and wife. The other time Vyasa was telling about the young woman who is enthusiastic to get married and wished and prayed to Shiva for 5 times. So these are different narratives we find. So why do we find so many different explanations, right? Because polyandry, even though it was prevalent, it was favored initially, but as the time passed by, Brahmanas did not like the concept of polyandry, and that is why when they were writing the later versions, they had tweaked the story a bit, and that is why there are so many different explanations. That is point number 2, assumption number 2. Assumption number 3, even though this was disfavored by Brahmanas, like clearly Brahmanas do not like the concept of polyandry, but it was prevalent in the Himalayan region. We have evidences that in the present day Himalayan region, back in those times, polyandry was very much practiced. The next is, why polyandry was practiced? Because there might be a shortage of women. Like the ratio of men to women might have been lesser. That is why one woman had to marry so many men, so that all men are married, right? So this is a situation of crisis. That is why polyandry was followed. That is what some scholars argue. The last point is, fifth point, basically, some argue that polyandry was not the only and most prevalent form of marriage. Definitely, it is not the only form of marriage, because we saw some other kinds also, like all those four kinds of marriages, right? Endogamy, exogamy, polyandry, polygyny, we've talked about. So, that polyandry is obviously not the only form of marriage, and definitely not the most prevalent, because exogamy was most prevalent. And if that is the case, if it is not the most prevalent, then why did authors choose to associate this practice with the central characters of Mahabharata? This is obviously a question we will have, and also historians have asked this question. And the answer is, or the conclusion they came to is, because creative literature has its own narrative requirements and doesn't always literally reflect social realities. Explanation needed. So, here, this particular set of scholars are completely rejecting the idea that Mahabharata was for real. They are saying that it is just a piece of fictional literature. There was a lot of scope for creativity and imagination, and that is how all the content in the Mahabharata was written, right? So obviously they will have their own narratives, so much creativity can be put in. And when we are talking about creativity, we need not have evidence for creativity, because creativity is totally related to the imaginations of the author's mind. He can write anything he wants, because it did not happen for real. So it did not have to necessarily reflect social realities. So I hope this point is clear. This is very important. The fifth point is very important. I hope that is clear to everybody. So, yes, that was handling texts and Mahabharata in particular. We are towards the last sub-theme of this chapter, which is basically a dynamic text. Again, this is the same thing. We will be talking about Mahabharata only. Mahabharata is basically called a dynamic text. Why is the question? Why is it called a dynamic text? There are various reasons to it. The first one is the growth of Mahabharata did not stop with Sanskrit version. As we all know, even though it was originally written in Sanskrit, eventually as time passed by, this has been translated to a lot of languages, right? So it did not just stop with Sanskrit. So that is one reason why it is called a dynamic text. The second is versions written in varieties of languages through an ongoing process of dialogue between people, communities, and those who wrote the text. When it was being written in different languages, it's not just the work of one person. Like, the author was not the only person responsible for writing a different version of Mahabharata. In fact, so many people came together, like so many communities came together. They established a forum, discussed about it, and then wrote it down. So the involvement of a lot of people makes it a dynamic text. The third is that stories that originated in specific regions or circulated among certain people found their way into epic. Again, we have stories originating from different regions of the Indian subcontinent. Even though the main focus is Kuru and Panchala regions, it also mentions the activities happening in different parts of the subcontinent, and that is why stories from different places have been clubbed together in one epic, which makes it dynamic. And fourth one is basically the central story was often retold in different ways. Like, it had the capability, like the text is in such a way that it is capable for people, or it had the ability to be narrated in different ways. Like, the central theme will be the same, but there are ways in which you can actually narrate it, like different ways. That is another important point. And not just that, but so many episodes of Mahabharata were depicted in sculptures and paintings. We often come across paintings and sculptures which give us a glimpse into the world of Mahabharata, right? Like we might see um, a picture of the Mahabharata war happening like a painting. So it also diverged into the fields of sculpting and painting. Lastly, it provided themes for a wider range of performing arts, which are plays, dance, and other kinds of narrations. It just didn't stop with sculptures and paintings. It also went into various other performing arts fields. For example, dances, right? If any of you all have seen any classical dance forms of India, like Kathak or Bharatanatyam or whatever it is, like all these dances usually have a story behind. Like they are depicting a story through the form of a dance. And most of the times we come across these dances and stories where the stories are from Mahabharata. So, in all these ways, because it can be depicted in so many ways, the central story can be told in different ways, the stories coming from different regions, so many people being involved in translating the text or writing a different version of it, like all these factors will prove a point that Mahabharata is a dynamic text, right? So that is it we have for today's class, and that is the end of chapter, guys. I kind of understand that the third chapter, even though it has limited pages, the concepts are very broad. It needs a lot of understanding and explanations. So that is why we took so many days to complete this particular chapter. I know there are some new things which we came across. If you all have any doubts regarding any topic, please do put them down in the comment section. I have been reiterating this point again and again. Since there is no platform for us to chat in a live session, I highly recommend put down your questions slash comments slash doubts, whatever it is, in the comment box. I will definitely reply to them by the end of the day when this video is being premiered. And yes, so we will have a quiz on chapter 3 on Monday, which is the 29th of August. Remember guys, we are having a quiz on 29th August, which is a Monday, right? So all of you all be prepared with chapter 3's quiz. We will definitely have a quiz. I hope all of you all will tune in to take the quiz. It's going to be interesting. Just like the other two chapters, I will be formulating a question set of 25, and at 6 p.m. on 29th of August, we will be having a quiz. In the meantime, please go through the videos once again. Please go through your textbooks. If you would have taken any notes or running notes, please go through them and prepare for the test well. It's not just MCQs this time, but we will also be having fill in the blanks or like true or false statements and all. So be prepared for that. And yes, I think we covered almost everything. So if you all ever want to subscribe for Unacademy Plus or Unacademy Iconic subscriptions, you all can use my code, which is TUM10, and get a 10% off straight away, guys. And yes, thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you on Monday at 6 p.m. again. We won't be having a class on Saturday and Sunday of this week. So that's a 2 days holiday. And yes, we will meet on 29th of August at 6 p.m. for a quiz. Thank you so much for coming in. And if you all like the video, if you like the content of the video, please do like it, share it, and also subscribe the channel Unacademy. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Have fun, guys. Have a good weekend. And thank you so much for coming in. Thank you. Have a good evening and have a good weekend, guys.